Before we begin our journey on this peaceful night, take a moment to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment telling us where you're watching from. It's always delightful to discover where our listeners rest their heads as they travel with us through these old memories. The bread beneath the pillow. In the distant days of my childhood, there was a curious habit I never dared to question until many winters had passed. Each night, after whispered prayers and the clinking of windows under the wind from the hills, my grandmother would place with firm and reverent fingers a small piece of darkened bread beneath my straw pillow. "It's so the plague feels satisfied and moves along," she'd whisper, as if confiding a secret to the angels at the threshold. The gesture was as old as the window frames or the scent of dried mint that lingered over the room. And I, still a boy, believed with all my heart that that dry bread was my silent sentinel. At the time, I didn't understand much about plagues. I only knew it was something that took neighbors, closed chapels, and made the bells ring even when no one was getting married. But Grandma, with her pale eyes and voice like an extinguished ember, said that old bread, if kept with faith and silence, confused the foul vapors of the night. They came seeking young bodies and flickering souls. But upon sensing the stagnant scent of sleeping wheat, they would turn away, convinced they'd already been there. A foolish superstition, the priests might say. But to me it was magic enough to sleep in peace. Over time, I began to carefully select the piece of bread destined for that sacred mission. I preferred the hardest ones, those that crackled like dry snow between my fingers, believing they'd better resist the hunger of wandering spirits. Sometimes I'd hide a fresh piece beneath the hearthstone to age in time, a small ritual of mine, done in secret while Grandma dozed in her wicker chair. The smell of that sleeping bread would mingle with the scent of my pillow and, for reasons I still can't explain, I always dreamt of golden fields and hidden nests beneath dry leaves. One night, during a particularly quiet winter, I heard my father say, his voice muffled by the steam of his porridge, that the custom dated back to the days when villagers died with dark fevers and upturned eyes. He said a boy, long before my time, had come up with the idea in a moment of pure fear and hope, to hide the bread not for himself, but so the plague would believe it had already been received there. It was a kind of silent bargain, like leaving an empty bench for an invisible traveler. And when the house survived, while others fell and that one still exhaled hot soup and muffled lullabies, the gesture began to be repeated, first out of necessity, then from memory, and finally out of love. As a child, I saw it as a secret game between me and the shadows of the world. There were nights I awoke with a racing heart, certain I had heard footsteps at the threshold or sighs coming from the attic. But just touching the pillow and feeling the firm shape of the bread was enough to calm me. It was there, steady as a promise. And if the plague dared to enter, it would find its peace already offered, its tribute accepted. I'd fall asleep again, curled like a barley grain in the dark, cradled by the distant crackle of firewood and the earthy scent of forgotten bread. As I grew older, I began doing the same for my younger brother, without explaining why. I'd just smile, fold a hardened crust, and say it was just in case. He accepted it, just as I had, without needing to understand. The belief wasn't a rule, but a gesture of tenderness, almost like adjusting someone's blanket in the middle of the night. Grandma would watch us in silence, her eyes misted with something between pride and longing. And even when her steps slowed and her hands could no longer cut the bread with precision, she insisted on reminding us, "Don't forget beneath the pillow, my dears. The plague likes homes that forget." Years later, when the fever swept the valleys again, many laughed at our custom. They said evil was fought with lime and reason, not with crumbs beneath cushions. But in our house, no one fell ill. The bread remained firm beneath the pillow, night after night, even if at times we had to divide it between luck and hunger. There was one dawn when my mother hesitated. The cupboard was empty, and the last piece of bread would be the only breakfast the next day. Even so, she smiled with resignation, split the center in two, and tucked the harder half beneath my pillow. "Awake, we endure need," she murmured. "But asleep, we must have peace." With the years, I learned to value less the logic of things and more the poetry they carry. The bread beneath the pillow wasn't a shield against the unseen. It was a reminder that we were alive, attentive, and that gestures of care still existed, even in the absence of certainty. When I became a father, I passed the ritual on to my daughter, who looked at me with a mix of doubt and wonder. I explained, as my grandmother had, "It's just an old custom, but they say it keeps away what cannot be seen." She laughed, asked for a small piece, "Because my dreams are light," and hid it beneath the pillowcase with tiny, confident hands. That same night, I watched her sleep for a while. The moonlight crossed the window gently, drawing soft shadows across her hair, spread on the pillow. The room was silent, except for the rhythm of her breath and the faint crackle of embers still alive in the hearth. I smiled at the thought of the little piece of bread tucked under her head, fulfilling a role far greater than any spell or prayer. It was as if it carried the whispers of all who had once feared the night and still chose comfort over despair. A few weeks later, she began to remember the bread on her own before bed. She chose the pieces carefully, smelled them like one picking flowers, and sometimes even gave them names. "This one is for luck. This one keeps nightmares away. This one is just to please the wind." I never corrected her. Childhood beliefs are small kingdoms of delicacy, and I knew that in her heart she was building something that would protect her all her life, not from plagues, but from the cruel silences of reality. And so the old custom that began in fear and took root in tenderness lived on, like a lullaby passed down from generation to generation. There was one especially long winter when snow came early and was slow to leave. Supplies dwindled, roofs groaned under the weight of ice, and the world seemed to sigh more than breathe. Still, even on the hardest nights, the little piece of bread was never missing under the pillow. Sometimes it was only a thin sliver, barely visible, but it was enough. My daughter, a little older by then, would say the bread had memory, and that even a fragment was enough to remind the darkness that here lived careful people who still honored ancient agreements. One day, I found a folded note inside her pillow. It was addressed to the plague with respect. It read, "If you're tired, feel free to rest somewhere else. We've already left your bread here and we're not good at goodbyes." I smiled, eyes misty. It was no longer just a custom. It had become a secret language between generations, a silent pact of resistance through gentleness. In that house, shadows might knock at the door, but they would always find a gesture of kindness waiting. And perhaps, because of that, they chose to pass on. The years flowed like rivers after the thaw, carrying away voices, scents, and promises. My daughter grew up, married, and moved with her husband to a village where the nights carry a different kind of silence. Still, during a visit one day, I noticed something that warmed my chest. While tidying up her son's room, little Tomas, she naturally slipped a hardened piece of bread beneath his pillow, without saying a word, without ceremony, just the gesture, pure as in the beginning. To ward off what frightens, or at least to remind that someone cared before sleep, she said with a soft smile. And in that instant, I knew the bread would continue its path, discreet as always, but eternal in its meaning. Today, with silver in my hair and slower steps, I still tuck my piece beneath the pillow. Not so much out of fear, by now I know that what's to come will come, but out of respect for those who came before. For my grandmother, who trusted the gesture as one plants seeds without needing to see flowers. For that ancient boy, name long forgotten, who one day invented this strange way of saying, "Stay away, but not in anger. For the invisible thread that connects aged and childish hands, all of them hiding, night after night, a piece of bread nearly turned to stone, but full of tenderness. And so, as the breeze hums through the window pane and the world rests beneath a cloak of silent stars, I fall asleep once more, with a soft pillow, a tired body, and a heart guarded by a bread that never forgot its duty, wine and ashes. I remember well that silver-haired woman whose slow steps seemed to carry the weight and wisdom of centuries. Her name was Madalena, and she lived on the outskirts of a village surrounded by wild vineyards and lavender fields. Her stone house, nestled at the foot of a hill, was always wrapped in a gentle morning mist, as if time itself hesitated to pass through. The scent of dried leaves, simmered wine and resin lingered in her kitchen, where the fire crackled unhurriedly like an old friend. They said she knew more about fevers than any cleric, and more about souls too. It was common to see her collecting charred twigs from others' hearths, murmuring softly as she wrapped them in linen cloths. Some laughed at her, others avoided her, but those with sick children or husbands sweating in delirium knocked on her door without hesitation. Her remedy was simple, at least in appearance: a goblet of red wine, ashes from sweet wood, fig tree, if possible, and a whispered prayer spoken 3 times, always with a hand over the chest of the ill. The liquid was warm, dark, and thick, and its taste, I was never brave enough to try it. But that night, something changed. A stranger crossed the village gates, feverish and barely conscious, and that's when something unforgettable began. He was brought in leaning on the shoulders of 2 peasants, his feet carving furrows in the moist evening earth. He was tall, even collapsed, and his hands bore not the marks of ploughs, but of ink and leather, the hands of a scribe or traveler. No one knew his name or where he came from, only that he had collapsed on the road, caught in spasms and murmuring in an unknown tongue. Madalena appeared without being called, as if she had sensed urgency in the wind. Wrapped in her dark cloak, her eyes half closed, she touched his forehead and said nothing. She simply pointed for him to be taken to her home, and so it was, as the sun sighed its last golden breath behind the hills. In her kitchen, warmed by ancient embers, she set to work. The wine, stored in clay jars, was gently heated with rosemary sprigs and a thread of rustic honey. On a smooth stone, she ground the ashes gathered that morning, mixing them carefully, as if preparing something sacred. Meanwhile, the stranger lay on a simple cot, wrapped in blankets and delirium. Madalena approached him, holding the still steaming goblet. She touched his brow with steady fingers and began the prayer, not in Latin, nor in the village's tongue, but in a slow, melodic murmur that sounded older than the village itself. She repeated it 3 times, unhurried, and at the end blew gently over the liquid, offering it to the parted lips of the ailing man. He drank with effort. Then came silence, and the subtle scent of burnt leaves in the air. Night fell heavy, with low clouds and damp doorframes, but inside all remained still, save for the soft popping of logs in the brazier. Madalena stayed seated by the cot, her eyes fixed on the visitor, as if waiting for the tide to turn. From time to time, she dipped a cloth in verbena infusion and passed it across his face, still hot like stone beneath the summer sun. Outside, dogs howled in the distance, and owls stirred in twisted branches. The minutes slid by like cold honey, and none of us dared interrupt that enchanted silence. Something in the air felt suspended, as if time itself held its breath. It was near midnight when the impossible began. The man, once limp as a forgotten rag, let out a faint groan. Then he turned with difficulty, and at last opened his eyes, clear as spring water, though still fogged. "Where am I?" he whispered, his voice coarse. Madalena simply smiled, satisfied, like someone watching a prophecy fulfill itself. The fever, which had devoured him like wildfire in dry fields, began to recede. His fingers stopped trembling. His breathing, once shallow and ragged, now followed the rhythm of burning wood. Steady, sure. And in that moment, none among us doubted. The wine, the ashes, and the whispered words had done something. Something even the city doctors would not dare to explain. The next morning, dew clung heavy to the vines, and a thread of mist wound down the trails like a bridal veil. The man was already sitting up, supported by a makeshift staff and Madalena's care. There was no more sweat on his brow, no delirium in his speech, only a deep fatigue, as if he had returned from very far away. He sat at the pale wood table, where Madalena offered rustic bread with walnut butter and a little more wine. This time, pure. He ate in silence, eyes downcast, hands trembling slightly, as if still touching a dream the world would not understand. It was only after the meal that he spoke of his journey. He said he came from the north, from lands where snow didn't melt even in summer, seeking answers he hadn't known how to ask. He spoke little, but there was something in his voice. A gentle melancholy, like someone who lost something precious long ago. When asked what he had felt while taking Madalena's potion, he hesitated. He said only that, for a brief moment, he heard the sound of ancient bells and the scent of burning lavender, and that during the fever, a veiled figure touched him in the shadows, a woman singing softly with hands made of light. No one dared laugh. Madalena, with calm eyes, merely collected the empty goblet and returned to the stove, as if she had known it all along. The news spread like a breeze through the vineyards, discreet, yet impossible to ignore. Some said Madalena had help from the saints. Others claimed her practice held something pagan, inherited from ancient women who spoke with the wind and understood the shadows of trees. Some sought priests, burned herbs by their windows, or asked for extra blessings on Sunday. But others knocked silently on her door, carrying fevered children or wives pale as wax. The old woman received them without judgment, as one who had seen all forms of pain and knew that healing does not choose by merit. As for the visitor, he stayed 3 more days. He slept long hours, walked slowly among the rosemary bushes, and sometimes wrote in a leather notebook he hid at the slightest sound. One morning, he gave Madalena a small box of dark wood. No one knew what was inside. She stored it away unopened and never spoke of the gift. On the 4th day, before the sun pierced the veil of clouds, the man left, alone, with the same silence in which he'd arrived. He looked one last time at the stone house and nodded. Ingratitude? Farewell? We never knew for certain. Seasons passed, and though few remembered the man's name, many recalled the night the fever was vanquished with wine, ashes, and words that sounded like windsong. Children grew up hearing the tale, each with a new detail. That he vanished into the mist, that he was a disguised prince or a weary angel. Madalena, however, never corrected anyone. She kept collecting ashes, gathered carefully on cold mornings, and prepared her potion the same way, a measure of wine, a pinch of ash, and 3 whispers no one could quite replicate. Years later, on an especially cold night, I was the one who knocked on her door. I carried my little sister wrapped in blankets, her eyes feverish and her lips dry as paper. Madalena opened before I could knock a second time. Her gaze passed through me, not rushed, but with the wisdom that recognizes desperation in silence. Without a word, she took us in, lit the embers, and began her work. I sat on the same bench where, they said, the stranger had once rested. The scent of heated wine and burning wood filled the air. When the dark liquid was offered to my sister, something in me knew, not through reason, but that forgotten part of the soul that recognizes mystery, that she would be all right. The next morning, my sister breathed peacefully, her cheeks rosy, and a faint smile at the corner of her lips, as if she had dreamt something beautiful. Madalena was already in the garden, gathering dew-damp twigs and whispering to the bees circling her herbs. I thanked her with simple words, for no prayer of mine could match the sincere relief I saw in my sister's waking eyes. Before we left, Madalena handed me a small envelope, thick and yellowed. "If one day the cold is greater than the fever," she said, "burn this in the hearth and listen in silence." I've kept the envelope to this day. I've never had to open it. Just having it nearby makes the world feel softer. Years passed, and Madalena finally departed, as quietly as she lived. She was found seated before the hearth, eyes closed and hands folded in her lap, as if she had simply drifted off after a long day. There was no pain on her face, no surprise, only peace, so much that visitors instinctively lowered their voices when entering. The box from the stranger remained where she'd placed it, untouched. Some suggested opening it, but no one dared. It was buried with her, beside the crooked fig tree that grew firm against the stone wall. And even now, when winter thickens and fevers return to the homes, there are those who whisper recipes under their breath, mixing wine and ash, as if still hearing the ancestral song among the flames. They say that, on very still nights, when the wind dances through dry leaves and the hearth crackles with extra warmth, you can hear an ancient murmur. 3 phrases whispered in the dark, like the cadence of a forgotten spell. It isn't heard with the ears, but with the skin, with the bones. As if time, for a brief moment, opened a crack, allowing Madalena's memory to walk among us, still gathering ashes and offering comfort. And those who've tasted her remedy, even without understanding its mysteries, carry the certainty that there is something sacred in silent care, in the simplicity of gesture, in faith that warms like wine. I myself, on nights like this, place a bit of rosemary in the flame and watch the smoke rise. I think of her and the serene light in her eyes. I close my own and let the memory wrap around me like an old quilt. And for a moment I am once again that young man sitting by the hearth, with my sister asleep and my heart finally calm. For some healings come not from earth or heaven, but from the exact space between the two, where the tenderness of hands that ask nothing in return still lives. May your sleep be gentle tonight, and if you dream of Madalena, tell her we still remember. The Rat Priest. I remember with tenderness a forgotten autumn, when the bells of the little village of Montrève rang in harmony with the creak of dry trees. It was a time when leaves crumbled in silence, bread was shared more carefully, and even the saints seemed to fall asleep earlier. There, between walls worn by moss and prayer, lived Father Thibault, a man of quiet faith, eyes as deep as well water, and hands always cold, as if they had vowed to touch only the invisible. Thibault was the vicar of the Church of St. Bartholomew of the Violets, a crooked little chapel atop the hill, where old folks dozed off on hard pews, and children feared the stained glass that seemed to watch them. But in that dark season, his faith began to tremble, not from heresy or doubt, but from rats. Yes, rats, small, bold, and miraculously multiplying. They came with the rain, nestled among the missals, gnawed at the liturgical vestments, and without asking permission, stole the consecrated bread from the tabernacle, as if mocking the sacred itself. Thibault tried everything. He summoned the innkeeper, who claimed to know all about traps, scattered mint in the cracks, as old Donatien recommended, even chanted psalms in Latin under the full moon. But the rats only yawned, as if they were tired parishioners bored of the liturgy. They came at night, marching silently across the wooden pews, as if seeking communion by crooked means. At first, the priest tried driving them away with buckets of holy water. Later, he simply whispered his prayers, as if not to wake them. Then, one mist-drenched morning, Thibault knelt before the altar and murmured something not found in any catechism. "Lord, if these rats are yours, then grant me the wisdom to convert them." It was a prayer born somewhere between exhaustion and madness, spoken with tears as sincere as any confession. And that very afternoon, after Vespers, he blessed the rats. Yes, one by one, or at least those who dared show themselves. He made the sign of the cross in the air with his thurible recited verses in a soft voice and called them little creatures of God. The faithful, confused, stopped attending Mass. But the rats listened. As days passed, something curious began to happen. The rats no longer chewed the books, nor climbed the altar with such audacity. Instead, they gathered in shadows, still and watchful, as if awaiting a homily of their own. The priest, who once trembled at the sight of them, now treated them as a peculiar flock. He called them by name, names he made up, of course, and delivered them sermons on meekness, detachment, and the value of contemplative silence. And at the end, he would leave them crumbs of unconsecrated bread, so they won't get confused, he'd say with a shy smile. The neighbors whispered. They said Thibaut had gone mad, that his church had become a sanctuary of pests and delusions. But no one could deny the rats had changed. They no longer invaded village homes, no longer appeared in kitchens or among barrels of flour. It was as if, for the first time in generations, a tacit truce had been made between men and rodents, brokered by a tired priest and his unconventional faith. But the miracle didn't stop there. One morning, on his way down the hill with a basket of stale bread for the market, Thibaut noticed a strange stir outside the church of St. Ludovina, the neighboring parish. It was a newer building of pale stone, tended by Father Guillaume, young, eloquent, and averse to metaphors. There, between the archways and the herb garden, tiny footprints marked the mud, and droppings as abundant as the congregation. The rats had moved, not vanished, simply migrated, like a flock, content with one pasture, now seeking another shepherd. Upon returning to his own chapel, now quiet and smelling of old incense and damp wood, Thibaut sat on the back pew and let out a sigh that was both relief and longing. Even rats follow the wind when it is faith that blows, he murmured. And although he had asked for nothing in return, he had received peace, quiet, and a gentle sense that somewhere between the absurd and the sacred he had been heard. From that day on, life at the Church of St. Bartholomew of the Violets resumed its old rhythm, or nearly. The faithful, once hesitant, began returning slowly, drawn not by miracles but by a sweet rumor. The priest who spoke to rats. There was something comforting in the thought that even the most forgotten by God, those with thin tails and tiny eyes, might find welcome beneath a consecrated roof. Some came out of pity, others from curiosity, but all stayed for the welcoming silence and the serene presence of Thibaut, who now celebrated Mass with the cadence of one who knows that even the smallest gaze may carry hope. Meanwhile, at St. Ludovina's, young Guillaume sweated between traps and fiery sermons. He summoned exorcists, lit candles in 3 colors, and even threatened the rats in harsh Latin. Nothing worked. The rats watched, unmoved, as if waiting for something more spiritual. When Thibaut heard of the commotion, he simply smiled at the breeze and said, "Perhaps they need fewer plagues and more blessings." Some claimed Thibaut had been lucky, or that the rats had simply grown bored of his gentle sermons and monotone chants. But the village elders, those silent keepers of wisdom unrecorded, whispered that it had been true faith, the kind not proclaimed from pulpits nor imposed in Latin, but whispered through small gestures and an open heart. And the rats, creatures older than any altar, may simply have recognized that. With time, Thibaut began including in his prayers not just the sick and the travelers, but also those forgotten by all names. He never specified who. It could have been a lonely old man, a weary rat, or a young priest who shouted too much. And though he never claimed any miracle, one morning he found at the church threshold a small piece of cheese, dry, gnawed, and left there with the care of an offering. Thibaut picked it up as one would accept a flower and placed it between the pages of a psalm on humility. Spring arrived shyly on the hill of Montreuil, bringing a new scent to the dawn, a mix of damp earth and small promises. The church, now calm, seemed to breathe easier. Violets bloomed again between the stones of the wall, and the bells rang with a discreet sweetness, as if calling not only the faithful, but also the creatures of the field. Thibaut continued his slow routine, tending the gardens, rotating the candles on the altars, reading gospel passages aloud, even when the nave was empty. "For whoever wishes to hear," he'd say, even if it was only the wind. From time to time, he still found subtle signs: a small hole dug near the hydrangeas, a strand of straw carefully braided between the pages of the missal, or a nut placed beside the reliquary. He told no one, but whenever it happened, his evening prayer took on a different tone, something between gratitude and quiet companionship. It was as if a covenant had been made, not with ink or promises, but with mutual respect between species that, during one brief winter, met through faith. And it was in that spirit of reverence that Thibaut began weaving parables into his homilies. Not about kings or martyrs, but humble little creatures, the ant that shared its crumb, the crow that waited for the snow to melt before stealing, and the rat, oh, the rat, who listened when no man dared to. The children, once restless in the pews, now sat attentive, eyes wide and mouths slightly open, as if sensing that those whispered stories held more truth than any noble's coat of arms. The village, in turn, blossomed in small gestures. The baker began leaving bits of bread on the walls. The healer, who once poisoned rats with rue, now placed bowls of water far from her herbs. It was not idolatry, nor a pact. Just a new reverence for the invisible, for what crawls between the cracks and survives without glory. And Thibaut, more stooped but lighter of step, continued on as one who shepherds not only a parish, but an ongoing dialogue with everything that breathes, even in silence. In time, the story of Thibaut, the rat priest, crossed hills and rivers, told by travelers between sips of broth and trades of blankets. Some laughed, others crossed themselves, but all listened. And in each new village the tale reached, a delicate question stirred in the heart. What if rats, too, carried a fragment of the divine? If even they held something sacred, then perhaps it wasn't so hard to believe that we, with all our faults and fears, might also be worthy of blessing. Thibaut, however, never sought recognition. He kept living among creaking walls, among faithful who dozed through the litanies, among leaves that fell silently over nameless graves. And when he finally departed this world, on a calm winter night like so many he had lived, his body was mourned by few. Yet they say that at dawn, as the bells rang gently, not a single rat was seen in the village. They had all quietly climbed the hill, gathering around the church for a final vigil. And so, among the timid crackle of candles and the hush of the night wind, the rats stayed silent, as if they understood. They remained until the final bell, the final hymn. Then in a calm line, they vanished into the woods, carrying not the priest's body, but something more subtle, the memory of a voice that never cast them out. Since then, it is said that the Church of St. Bartholomew has never again had rats, nor loneliness. At times, they say, you can hear a faint rustle among the pews, like the tiny footsteps of invisible creatures, quietly watching. And when the dry leaves begin to dance in the courtyard, some say Thibaut still walks between the chapel's old walls, not as a ghost, but as a gentle memory that drifts through the cracks. His name was never carved into stained glass nor written in history books, but it lives in the crumbs left in corners, in the silent respect for the small, and in the whispered truth that perhaps the truest faith is the one that blesses even what the world has forgotten. And so night after night the hill sleeps in peace, guarded by a promise without words, dried frog amulets, I remember fondly a particularly damp winter in Brannenwald when the scent of wet firewood mingled with the dried herbs hanging from the ceiling of Elfric the healer's house. He was a man of short stride and long gaze, always cloaked in a wool mantle that carried small sounds. The clinking of glass vials, the whisper of roots swaying in linen pouches, and of course the soft rustle of his most peculiar amulet, a dried frog, tied with a braided cord, which he wore around his neck like a sacred relic. People said it warded off fevers, chased away ill winds, and kept the sickness of the soul at bay. It was an ancient tradition, older even than the village's earliest records, practiced only by the most traditional of healers, and for that very reason surrounded by reverence and a fair bit of discomfort at festive dinners. I remember the first time I saw the frog. I was just a boy, seated on the stone bench beside the inn's hearth, when Elfric entered, his figure wrapped in mist and solemnity. The frog swung like a magical pendulum on his chest, shriveled and wrinkled like a strip of old leather, its eyes reduced to two hollow pits. Some turned away, others made discreet signs of protection with their fingers, but he, unbothered, sat by the fire, drank his barley soup, and wove stories in a soft voice, as if stitching words into the steam rising from his bowl. They said the amulet had belonged to his grandfather, and his grandfather's grandfather, all healers before him, all guardians of knowledge never written down. The dried frog tradition was not exclusive to Elfric, but in him it found its most dramatic expression. Some healers kept their frogs tucked away in embroidered cloth pouches, others hung them discreetly beneath their tunics. Elfric, however, wore his openly, like an insignia, a dangling truth. And strange as it was, there was something oddly comforting in seeing it sway as he walked through the village, visiting the sick and blowing root tea into the nostrils of the feverish. It was as if, while that frog was near, illness knew it was not welcome. That season, however, something went amiss. The feudal lord, a portly man with a discerning palate named Dom Henricus, decided to honor Elfric with an invitation to the solstice banquet. A rare, almost ceremonial gesture meant to recognize the healer's efforts during the outbreak of pale fever that had swept the village weeks before. Elfric arrived in his darkest attire, beard combed with lemon balm oil, and of course the dried frog hanging from his chest like an ancestral medallion. He sat at the polished stone table between the chaplain and the apothecary, accepted the blueberry wine with a solemn nod, and for a while everything proceeded in respectful silence. But fate, ever inclined toward mischief, chose to intervene at the exact moment the main soup was served. A gust of wind slipped through the tall window slats, bringing with it a swirl of leaves and dust that filled the hall, making the candlelight flicker and cast dancing shadows across the table. Elfric, leaning forward to shield his goblet, didn't notice the hemp cord loosening around his neck. With a faint snap, inaudible to all but me watching from afar, the amulet slipped free, spun in the air like an autumn leaf, and landed with uncanny precision in the steaming soup of Dom Henricus. For a moment, the entire hall froze. The muffled plop of the frog into the thick broth echoed like a quiet thunder among the suspended cutlery. Dom Henricus furrowed his brow, peered into his bowl with narrowed eyes, and with the tip of a pewter spoon fished out the intruder, raising for all to see that shriveled creature, limbs curled and mouth agape, now glistening with golden drops of duck fat. The silence was so deep you could hear the fire crackling in the hearth crest and the embarrassed mewl of a kitchen cat who clearly sensed impending doom. Elfric, red as the wine in his cup, stood with a jolt, words trapped in his throat. He tried to explain that it was an amulet, a protection, a sacred and ancient tradition. But Dom Henricus, a man of few beliefs and many eccentricities, lifted the frog between two fingers, examined it from all angles like a tasteless sculpture, and let out a booming laugh that made the stained glass of the nearby chapel tremble. And as it often happens in courts and taverns, where a powerful man's laughter gives permission to all, soon everyone at the table erupted in uncontrollable laughter. Even the chaplain, who tried in vain to hide his smile behind a goblet. Elfric remained standing, uncertain, eyes caught between shame and hesitation. But then, with a resigned sigh, he bowed and, to everyone's surprise, said with a firm voice, "If the frog chose your soup, my lord, it must be a sign of eternal protection." In a bold, or perhaps purely desperate gesture, he pulled a pouch of lavender from his belt and sprinkled it over the bowl like one sealing an ancient spell. The act was so unexpected, so theatrical, and at the same time so absurdly graceful that the laughter shifted into applause, clinking mugs and good-natured whistles. That night the frog remained at the center of the table like a living joke, toasted and mentally photographed by all present. The squire began calling it Sir Croak, and someone suggested it be taxidermied and hung in the kitchen as guardian of the pots. Elfric, with some dignity restored, sat again, accepted a second cup of wine, and let the others' laughter wash over him like a mantle of indulgence. After all, in those parts, surviving ridicule was nearly as important as curing a fever, and that night he had done both with a single misstep. By morning, the village woke with a new proverb: "He who wears a frog around his neck will never lack a story at supper." And as all good sayings go, it spread quickly among the washerwomen, the boys in the square, and the market merchants. The story had already begun to grow in exaggeration. Some said the frog had leapt into the soup of its own accord, guided by invisible forces. Others swore Dom Henricus had swallowed a piece and now enjoyed miraculous health. Elfric, for his part, simply smiled in silence while grinding dried leaves and roots in his stone mortar. Strangely, the scandal didn't diminish the tradition. It revived it. Soon other healers in the region began displaying their frogs more boldly, some hanging from belts, others sewn discreetly into robes. Children started crafting small frog-shaped amulets from clay, painting them with natural dyes and gifting them to grandparents as charms for good health. Even the blacksmith, a skeptical man with steady hands, kept a wooden frog in his toolbox drawer. "Just in case," he'd mutter, glancing sideways as if afraid someone might take him seriously. Over time, Dom Henricus himself began to joke about the incident in his speeches. He told visitors that his fortress was guarded by a withered warrior with batrachian skin, and he made a point of showing them the shelf where the frog had been carefully dried and placed on a piece of embroidered linen. He called it the house's quietest counselor, and swore that ever since that day his stomach pains had vanished. The truth probably had more to do with the new cook, a woman of few words and skilled hands, but no one dared question the talisman's power. As for Elfric, he was summoned to the castle more often, not only for his herbs, but for his sense of spectacle, as the headmaid put it with a crooked smile. With each visit, he brought a new charm: tiny bones braided with string, rabbit teeth wrapped in mint leaves, or miniature gourds filled with dry seeds that jingled like timid bells. But no object ever caused as much stir as the old frog. It remained in memory, sometimes with laughter, sometimes with a touch of superstitious awe, and deep down, everyone seemed to feel there was something magical in that ridiculous scene. One evening, at the tail end of that winter, the sky turned golden and the village bells rang softer than usual. Elfric, sitting beneath the still sleeping vines of the cloister, calmly told a group of apprentices the frog's tale. Not as a scandal, but as a lesson. "Not every stumble is a fall," he said, stirring a cup of Angelica root tea. "Sometimes it's just the world finding a way to remind us that laughter heals too." The youths listened intently, eyes wide, and when the story ended, one of them pulled from his pocket a small carved stone, shaped like a frog, and offered it to the master. Elfric accepted it with a smile that seemed to come from a long way off. And so, between shared laughter, steaming broths and talismans of dubious origin, the village carried on. The dried frog, once a source of fear and mockery, became a symbol of protection, a reminder that even the most awkward moments carry their wisdom. People still fell ill, as is the way of life, but they also continued to heal, sometimes with Elfric's help, other times simply with the comfort of a good story told by the fire. And in all those stories, when the moment came where the frog fell into the Lord's soup, voices always softened, eyes sparkled and hearts warmed, as if everyone knew deep down that hidden in that absurd mishap was a gentle secret about laughter, healing, and the enchanted accidents of life. And so, dear listener, as the night's embers slowly fade and the wind brushes softly against the windows like an old friend passing by, I leave you with this memory of swinging frogs, steaming stews, and candlelit smiles. May it lull you to sleep with the gentleness of stories that ask for no haste. And may you awaken with a trace of wonder, the kind that lives quietly in the little confusions of the old world. Good night, and until our next journey through the mists of time. The Snake Oil Swindler. It was during a gentle spring, when the wildflowers smiled once again along the roadside and the chapel bells chimed beneath the warm breeze, that a man arrived in the village. A man with a sweet voice and eyes that never stopped moving. He wore a faded green cloak, weathered by time, and from his waist hung a noisy satchel filled with translucent vials that sparkled in the sun like tiny relics. He introduced himself as Sylvanus, heir to the wisdom of the ancients from the east, though he smelled more of dried onions than enlightenment. The children followed him first, enchanted by his theatrical gestures and the promise of something called sacred snake oil, a miraculous elixir that, according to him, could heal the body, soothe the soul, and perhaps even mend broken hearts if rubbed over the chest at dusk. Soon, the murmurs grew. Old Brigida, who rarely left her window, was seen hobbling to the square. The blacksmith, who hardly trusted his own shadow, bought 2 bottles, one for his shoulder pain and the other just in case. Even the parish priest, ever skeptical, lent an ear for a moment, lured by the biblical language with which the stranger anointed each phrase. The oil, golden and thick, was served solemnly atop linen cloths, wrapped in ancient promises and a faint scent of eucalyptus. And so, slowly and effortlessly, the stranger won over hearts, coins, and a trust that would last no longer than the cheapest bottle. That night, the village felt different. Lights flickered longer in the windows, and small groups gathered around hearths, passing the shimmering vials from hand to hand like talismans. There were hushed chuckles, hopeful whispers, even the occasional sigh of relief from someone who swore their knees already felt lighter. Sylvanus himself dined at the inn, surrounded by enchanted eyes and a wine goblet that never emptied. He told stories of distant ravines where sacred serpents slept beneath moonlight, and how only he and his bloodline knew how to extract their oil without awakening divine wrath. No one dared doubt him. It was too late for doubts and too early for regrets. But when the next day came, he was gone. The bed at the inn lay untouched, the wine undrunk on the table. No footprints, only the back door left ajar, as if carried open by the wind. The vials remained, so did the aches. As the hours passed, smiles turned to grimaces, praise gave way to grumbling. The sacred oil cured no more than a damp cloth. Some said he had escaped with the innkeeper's horse, others swore he vanished in a swirl of blue smoke. But between murmured curses and lost coins, one soft and bittersweet truth lingered. For one night they had all believed, and perhaps that had been enough. In the days that followed, the village swayed between mockery and awkward silence. The blacksmith, once so proud, now hid the bottles behind the oven, as if their golden glow might shame him. Old Brigida returned to her window, muttering that her knees hurt even more now, perhaps from too much hope. And the priest, though never mentioning the stranger again, was seen one afternoon rubbing oil into his temples like a man praying without belief. Still, no one could deny the enchantment of that night. As if, for a fleeting breath in time, they had all forgotten the weight of the land, the cold of winter, the sniffles, and their broken hearts. The children were the last to stop looking for Sylvanus. They hid behind roadside bushes, hoping to glimpse his billowing cloak or hear the clinking of those magical bottles. One of them, little Thomas, swore he saw him speaking to cows at dawn in the pasture. But no one listened to the boy, who also chatted with chickens. Deep down, most preferred to believe he had left for faraway lands, not just someone's barn. It was easier to think of him as a passing tale, like one of those wandering legends, charming, deceitful, and swift as the wind. Then one afternoon, weeks later, something curious happened. An old bottle was found atop the chapel's altar, beside a rusted coin and a sprig of dried lavender. No one could say how it got there. The priest swore he knew nothing, though his voice trembled as he denied it. The village whispered for days. Had Sylvanus returned in secret? Had he felt remorse? Or was it just another performance, a final act to preserve the mystery? Either way, the bottle was left untouched, like a tiny altar to shared naivety. No one moved it, and no one dared throw it away. With time, the story faded into memory. The elders told it to the young, exaggerating each retelling. Now he flew on a carpet of herbs, now he spoke with snakes as if they were neighbors. The central well, where many had gathered to hear his promises, became a place for jokes and friendly mockery. But on breezy nights, when the sky filled with stars and the scent of roses returned to drift across the rooftops, it was not uncommon for someone to sigh and say, "At least he let us dream, even if just for one night." It was old Marius who put it best one evening by the fire. "There are lies that wound," he said, stirring his nettle tea slowly, "and lies that warm the bones for a night, then vanish with the dew." No one replied, but all understood. Because even the most skeptical, even those who swore never to trust a stranger again, held somewhere in their soul a sweet remnant of that visit, a memory of easy laughter, of promises sealed in glass, and of the hope, however fleeting, that the world still held miracles in small doses. And as for Sylvanus, the snake oil swindler, well, no one ever heard from him again. Some claimed they saw him at distant fairs, selling unicorn dust or tonics to chase away sad ghosts. Others said he was swallowed by his own silver tongue, carried off by the winds that bear away storytellers. But perhaps, just perhaps, he knew exactly what he was doing. For in a weary village, calloused and doubtful, he left behind something no one else could sell, that fleeting sense of wonder. And for that, they say, the gods, and even the serpents, let him go in peace. Now, whenever I pass through the square where he once set up his little stall, the stone benches are covered in moss and children play with twigs, unaware that one night miracles were truly believed in there. Sometimes I hear the sound of glass in the wind. Perhaps nothing, or perhaps the echo of a bottle that never shattered. Time, that old performer, has let the whole affair blur, like a dream dissolving at dawn. But I remember, not the deceit itself, but the spark it lit within us. Brief and illusory though it was warm, and it was good. And so ends the memory of the man with light steps and smooth promises. I don't keep him with bitterness, nor with reverence. I keep him as one keeps a tale told by the fire, with a smile on the lips and a blanket over the knees. For on those nights when the world grows heavy and the aches return to the shoulders and joints of the soul, I sometimes find myself wishing for another bottle, not to cure the body, but to bring back that night when all of us, just for a moment, believed in the impossible. Songs against fever. I remember that winter well, not for the precise cold, which was the same as every year, but for the distinct sound that lingered over the hills. A brief melody, just 3 notes, drifted between the chimneys, and slipped through window cracks like an old cat seeking the warmth of the firewood. It was the song of Brenor, the healer of the valley, and they said that merely hearing it made fever draw back, like a beast afraid of light. Many came from afar just to lie down in his darkened room, wrapped in coarse wool blankets, and let the melody warm their foreheads. Brenor was small, bent like the roots he used in his infusions, and spoke little, as if he had learned to measure sound with the same reverence one uses to measure time. His cottage, nestled between two moss-covered rocks, held shelves of thick glass, herbs drying in bundles, and a stringed instrument that never seemed to be tuned, only played with tenderness. But it wasn't the instrument that mattered. It was the melody. They said it was as old as the fever itself, taught to him by a woman with grey eyes and an absent voice in a summer no one else remembered. And every winter he sang it, always the same, always gently. At dusk, when the sky turned that particular shade of lilac known only to cold months, Brenor would sit by the hearth, rest his hands on his lap, and release the first note. It was low, round, almost like the earth yawning. The second rose slightly, as if peeking over a wall. And the third never seemed to end. There was something in it that trembled, not with cold, but with tenderness. It was like the last leaf clinging to a branch, or the sigh just before sleep. Children called it the blanket note, because it seemed to cover everything. Even the most skeptical mothers brought their children and let them fall asleep to that brief sequence, repeated with the patience of a weaver. It wasn't rare to see feverish eyes close before the second round was finished, and though Brenor would say healing came from rest and hot water, everyone knew it was the song. Monks from nearby tried to transcribe the melody onto parchment, translating it into Latin, but it lost its soul on the page. It had to be heard between wooden walls, with tea steam rising like incense and the wind creaking through old roof tiles. Over time, Brenor's song spread beyond the neighboring villages. Shepherds whistled it softly while watching over frost-covered flocks, and washerwomen hummed it by the stream, hoping the cold water might sting a little less. Some said even the crows fell silent when it was sung, not from fear, but out of respect. And when someone fell ill, no one asked for ointment or remedy. They asked for the melody. It became a kind of secular prayer, passed from grandparents to grandchildren with the solemnity of a secret entrusted to time. In the village where I grew up, a group of elderly women kept the tradition alive. Each time the wind changed direction and brought with it the scent of damp wood and trampled hay, sure signs that winter had arrived, they gathered on the rectory porch to sing the three notes. Their voices were frail, some trembled, but when they sang together, something aligned with the world. The song was never recorded, never written down. You only had to close your eyes to hear it, as if for the first time. Low, rising, sustained, like a blanket woven from sound. Once, when I was still very young and burned with fever for 3 nights straight, my mother carried me to the hill where Brenor lived. I don't remember the climb nor his face, only the warm dimness of the cabin and the scent of wax and dried leaves in the air. But I never forgot the song. He didn't speak to me. He simply sat near my makeshift bed, gently blew on the coals, and began to sing the 3 notes, one after the other, as if caressing the soul from the inside out. Something in my body loosened, as if the pain stepped back to make room for sleep. The next morning, I woke up sweating, weak but relieved, with the feeling that I had walked through a field of mist and returned safe and sound. My mother said I had slept through the night, breathing gently, and that the old healer hadn't left my side until dawn. She cried as she thanked him, but he only nodded with a faint smile, as if he had heard that gratitude 1,000 times, and knew it wasn't really for him, but for the melody he merely kept safe in his hands. Over the years, Brenor grew even older, if that was possible. His steps slowed, his words dwindled, but the melody, Ah, that never lost its strength. Even when his voice failed, he would mark it with a soft whistle or by tapping 3 hollow stones, each with a slightly different tone. The children, who once came out of need, began to visit out of affection. They sat around the hearth in silence, waiting for the 3 notes as if they were whole stories condensed into sound, and he, with half-closed eyes, offered them like a gift long treasured. When Brenner passed, and they say it was during a snowstorm so serene even the bells fell silent, the village didn't make a fuss. No funeral bells, no sad speeches. People simply walked to the hillside at dusk, gathered beneath bare hazel branches, and sang the small song once together. 3 notes, pure and clear, carried into the wind like dry leaves returned to the earth. No one wept aloud. No one spoke. The melody was enough. After that, something strange happened. Every time the cold returned, even in distant villages, someone seemed to recall the melody. Not perfectly. Sometimes a note too high, another too short, but with a tenderness that kept its essence alive. It passed from mouth to mouth, from fire to fire, like a gentle charm against fever and forgetfulness. The elders would say it wasn't the mind that remembered, but the blood, that there was something in that simple sequence that soothed not just the body, but the soul. And so Brennor's song was not lost. It became a hymn among the winter-sick, whispered in snow-covered cottages, sung by exhausted mothers, repeated by wrinkled hands that knew sometimes a soft sound is worth more than all medicine. On the coldest nights, when the wind stung the skin and dreams hid away, just one low rising note, and that last one lingering like a thread of warmth in the air, that was enough. Even without instant healing, even with the illness still present, something within us settled. Now, when fever visits my home, the kind that only asks for rest and silence, I find myself humming the song, sometimes aloud, sometimes only in my mind, like guiding a good thought back to where it belongs. My children don't know where it comes from, but they know it. They ask for it as one asks for a story, a comfort, a gentle touch. And I offer it, not as someone who sings, but as one who lights a candle. 3 notes, and there it is. The room feels less cold. I like to think that Brenner still hears it from somewhere beyond the frozen hills. That each winter, when human voices carry that little melody, he smiles. Not out of pride, but knowing he safeguarded something beautiful enough to endure time. And maybe that's what certain songs do, not just soothe fevers, but keep warm the part of the world that still believes in care, in silence, and in tenderness. Good night, traveler. May this song, brief, ancient, familiar, warm you too this evening.